everything is open. But the question is are too many people go there? Not as usual. Not as usual. But everything is open now. In culture, theaters, cinemas, they complain that not many people cancel and not many.
Yeah.
Hello, Geshe.
Hello, Geshe.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, everyone.
So good to see you all. We're so very happy to be here again, like every week, and we're very appreciative. And we're grateful for what we've got here. It's very precious, very rare. And thank you so much, Geshe.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Laura. So let's start right away with some breathing meditation. And then visualize in the space in front of you, Buddha Shakyamuni, who appears in the form of a fully ordained monk, wearing the 3 saffron-colored robes. His legs in the full lotus posture. His right hand touching the earth mudra. His left hand in the mudra of meditation or meditative equipoise. With his left hand holding a begging bowl. Seated on a moon disk, which is on top of a sun disk, which in turn lies on an open lotus flower. The Buddha smiles full of compassion and wisdom down at you. While he's surrounded by all the great masters of the last 2,500 years. Most importantly, by the great Nalanda masters of India. Like Nagarjuna, Ayadeva, Buddha Palita, Chandakirti, and so forth. And he's surrounded by the great lineage lamas of Tibet, of the different Tibetan Buddhist traditions. By the great masters of the Chinese, Vietnamese, Japanese tradition. The great masters of Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Burma, and so forth. And all of them, including the Buddha, being inseparable from your Lama or your Lamas. All of them inspiring us and guiding us on the way to liberation and enlightenment. And then think that you're surrounded by all sentient beings. For the purpose of whom we're practicing the Dharma. All of them wanting to be happy, wanting to be loved, understood, and accepted for who they are. And yet constantly creating the causes for more suffering, for more problems. And so first generate deep affection in the form of affectionate love, a sense of closeness, seeing each and every one of these beings and as endearing, as lovable, as precious. precious and particular to their incredible potential. And then pay special attention to all their suffering. And the causes of those sufferings. In particular, their self-grasping, and their self-cherishing. And generate great compassion, the wish, the aspiration, may they all be free from whatever prevents them from experiencing real lasting happiness. May I be able to help them to overcome all those obstructions. And that aspiration, that wishing type of mind, slowly grows stronger, giving way to the determination. I will do whatever it takes. And however long it takes me to accomplish this, to lead all sentient beings toward a state free from suffering and its causes. And that way generate the altruistic attitude. Try to really feel from the depth of your heart this determination that is driven by great love and compassion towards all sentient beings. Which then gives way to bodhicitta, the wish to become fully enlightened, to become a Buddha, in order to be of greatest benefit to all sentient beings. And remind yourself that it is also with this intention that we continue to study Chandrakirti's entering the middle way. And then we start with taking refuge and once again deepen the mind of enlightenment. Can we have the prayers? Thank you. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, of practicing generosity, and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And then let's focus specifically on all sentient beings surrounding you. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And then directing at the merit field, the space in front of you. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence, and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. Okay, all right. Well then, I hope I get it right. Dalit. I received a few emails from you, but there were no questions, right?
There was 2 questions. One from Jimmy. It's inside of the mail.
Okay.
And one from...
Okay. All right. Sunday
It
study.
shows up that it's a Sunday class question, but inside the Gmail,
okay.
it's quite...
There's like an article by Vesna A. Wallace, right? You send that article, and inside that article, there's a question?
No, there was just one. I will go to the Gmail.
Okay.
Just a moment.
And then you also sent me this really beautiful picture. Maybe we can make that available of that reflection in a lake. So the Tibetan Buddhist example, I should say, of like a reflection in a lake. So maybe you could put that in the group. Yeah, that's beautiful.
There was a mail from Jasmine.
Well, maybe just forward it to me once again. I'll do it next time. Never mind then. I'll do it next time. Okay.
Quite hard with the Gmail sometimes. I don't know why it doesn't do it very well.
Okay, never mind. It doesn't matter. It probably isn't in a rush.
Apologize from the other people. Sorry.
No, that's all right. It doesn't. Okay. Anyway, so let's start with this coming week's homework, if you like. So as you remember, we're in the process of generating bodhicitta. And before that, of course, we need to generate a few other types of mind, including great compassion. So we got to great compassion and a type of affection. We briefly went through it in the motivation, in setting the motivation, but in this particular context, of course, we spent more time with it. And so it's defined as a mind, an affectionate mind that wishes for all sentient beings to be free from suffering. And what's more so, wishes to protect all sentient beings from suffering. And as we've learned so far, here suffering doesn't just refer to ordinary suffering, it includes all three types of suffering. Suffering of suffering, which is ordinarily described as suffering, suffering of change, and pervasive compositional suffering. Now, of course, before we would want someone else to be free from these three types of suffering, we need to first feel ourselves, well, it really sucks to have these three types of suffering, and to generate the wish, may I be free, may I be liberated from them. Yeah, well, may I be free from them. So we didn't start with the first type that is ordinarily described as the first type. We started with the third type. So 2 weeks ago, I asked you to reflect on the fact that our body and mind is in the nature of suffering. It is the basis for all our, suffering of suffering and even our limited happy experiences. So it's the basis. And I gave you some reasons. So don't forget those. Again, the fact that, we can get sick at any time, that of course we can have problems at any time. The potential for something worse is there ever present with this body. But what's more so, it actually just has the potential to create suffering, in that if we don't do anything, it will naturally lead us, in particular our body, to it needs to be fed, it needs to be clothed, it needs to, it requires so much effort to just keep it from leading to greater suffering, such as hunger, thirst, cold, heat, and so forth. And that fact, the fact that our body and our mind is in the nature of that. So also with our mind, we may feel fine right now, but the mind has the potential to experience great fear and depression and so forth. So first of all, it has that potential. And unless we make an effort, if we just remain, we leave the mind the way it is, afflictive emotions will arise effortlessly, which leads to, greater suffering than we experience now. And so there's no certainty as to what is going to happen on a mental and physical level. And this fact induces ignorance, induces a misapprehension, in particular when it comes to the actual nature of mind and body. And here talking about on a conventional level, the fact that body and mind are in the nature of suffering. But then we discussed last week, I asked you to meditate on the suffering of change, which are the moments of relief that we usually identify as great happiness, as happy experiences, maybe even great happiness. But we all know the moment the happiness is there, it's already on its way out. The problem is we grow attached to it. We want it to last. We want it to come again and again. And of course, that's just not what's going to happen. Yes, something triggers this well-being, but the moment it's there, even that first moment of elation, that first moment of happiness, it's already on its way out. It's already changing to disappear and give way to a different feeling. But we are attached to it. We want it to be repeated. Whatever makes us feel good, we want more of it. So therefore, that suffering of change induces attachment. So I asked you last time, reflect on this and become aware. Of course, not just we suffer from that, others do too. But what's worse is not just that. Then, of course, there's what we identify as suffering. That's what I want you to focus on this time. And that usually gives rise to aversion. It's just a natural tendency. If we suffer, if there's something unpleasant, we look for the cause of that. We usually find it in another person, in a situation, the politicians, the government, the municipality, my family, my kids, my parents, and so forth. And so we find causes, we look for causes, and aversion arises. So not only do we experience the suffering, on top of it, we create the causes for new suffering with aversion. Aversion, of course, depending on how strong it gets and what it induces, what it makes us do. Well, we may go out of our way, insult someone, physically harm them, and so forth. So therefore, that is called the suffering of suffering. Please spend some time, and that's probably easiest, really, because there's so much suffering around us. There's so much suffering in our own life, and we naturally want to be free from it. And then to look around, there's so many problems, so much suffering in this world. Of course, causes being suffering of disasters, problems happening, external circumstances that give rise to that. Due to the living conditions a person finds themselves in, natural disasters, but these also the stressful life in the West, not eating the right kind of food and having a stressful life. So just to think about that. Addiction is so terrible. People who are addicted to drugs, alcohol, to gambling, sexual addictions, I mean, we are already controlled by our afflictive emotions, but in that case, it's even stronger, this attachment or a desire that they experience, and so little control. I mean, how terrible. And others go through that. Imprisonment. It's so terrible to be imprisoned. I mean, it seems like these luxurious prisons, maybe in the West, in Israel, and so forth. It's like, it's not too bad. But I mean, not too bad. I mean, well, yeah, in comparison to other places, but just the fact you can't control anything about your life. When you get up, when you go to sleep, what you eat, and so forth. It's just terrible. So to really spend this week with all the different kinds of problems that people have, physical, of course, but also mental problems. So many. So much suffering on the mental basis. Sometimes something can be done with therapy. Sometimes, well, the person needs to take drugs in order for the chemical imbalances to be taken care of, and so forth. But so much suffering, no matter how wonderful the life of the other person seems. Of course, people will always pretend that their lives are great. Many people do. But the suffering behind, so unbelievable oftentimes. Especially when people have no access to the Dharma, like no idea what makes them happy, believing that greed and insult and all these terrible actions, that they bring them some happiness, and of course they don't. But just the fact that we have self-cherishing, it is so painful. Painful in the sense that, well, due to self-grasping, there is self-cherishing, and self-cherishing is an attachment to the I that the stronger it is, the more it leads to fear. Being afraid for the I, being scared of someone harming me, of losing something. So I'm scared of the future. What may happen? All this fear of the future, the fear of losing what is mine, or that which is mine may be harmed. So my relatives, my friends, and so forth, my country, and so forth. Fear of, well, things that are so intangible. I mean, my food, my house, there's got some tangibility to it, but just my reputation. Reputation. What is reputation anyway? It's another person thinking I'm this, that, and the other. Based on that, I label reputation, but it seems this concrete thing, my success. I mean, it's so empty of inherent existence. It's so obvious that it's merely labeled. What is one person's success is another person's failure. And still I feel there's this success there and I'm worried about it. So there's always this worry about some impending disaster, the worry of losing something with regard to the future. And of course, the unhappiness about what happened to me in the past and so forth. So all this suffering, just that, it's already a suffering of suffering, even without thinking of the other afflictive emotions that arise and karma that's being accumulated. Just having self-cherishing. To really think, all these endless living beings having self-cherishing, suffering because of that, never being able to totally relax and be totally peaceful and at ease, because there's always this sense of impending dread of something may happen, something may harm myself. And on top of that, of course, the other afflictive emotions, the karma they accumulate and so forth. So to really give it some time, this incredible suffering that beings go through, and which gives rise to anger, therefore. So based on our own example, of course, but mainly taking it towards other sentient beings and generating the sincere wish, may they be free. May they be free from the other two types of sufferings. But the focus for this week, the suffering of suffering. Okay, that's what I want you to do for this coming week. All right. And then let's go back to the text. We'll answer questions next time. So what have we done so far? We've started with the enumerations of emptiness, as we've heard. There's initially a brief presentation of the enumerations of emptiness. They were described in verse 179 and 180, two brief verses where it just briefly says, well, in order to liberate sentient beings, to lead sentient beings to liberation, the Buddha taught, of course, selflessness, but he didn't just leave it at that. He taught selflessness in terms of two types, selflessness of person and selflessness of phenomena other than person. And then to make it even clearer, for the sake of different people needing different things, different trainees, the Buddha then expounded on this, expounded these two in a more elaborate way. So he enumerated them as, for instance, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, described the 16 types of emptiness. And then in verse 180, we're taught, well, and having taught those in such an elaborate way, these 16 times, again, he summarized them into 4. So this is a very typical thing of going about explaining any kind of concept. Of course, it usually has, the more complicated it is, the more subdivisions it may have. Well, not necessarily, but in this case, you can divide it. And then you have a more extensive categorization, which then, for the sake of, once you've understood all these categories, you can then again summarize it once again and kind of, boil it down here in this case to 4 different types. And then the extensive explanation of the 16 types of emptiness starts. And those 16 types, they're explained by way of sets of 4 sets of 4. So 4 times 4 is 16. The first sets of these 4, it starts with verse 181. It describes the emptiness of inner phenomena, the emptiness of outer phenomena, then the emptiness of both inner and outer phenomena, and the emptiness of emptiness. Now, I already said something about it before, but just in case it wasn't that clear yet. The first three, just talking about them on a conventional level, first of all, before talking about their emptiness, we of course need to understand them first before we can really understand their emptiness, because to understand that they lack inherent this, that, and the other, like being inherently an inner phenomenon, for instance, or being merely labeled on the basis of its parts, its characteristics. So for that, we need to understand its parts, its characteristics. All right. Now, as I said before, here, the inner phenomena, if you like, refer to the sense faculties as they're described. And then the outer are described as the sense objects. And then that which is both inner and outer, that is the physical basis for the sense faculties. Now, what is that teaching us? It's actually telling us, well, it all comes down to the mind, consciousness. Consciousness is at the center of everything. It's responsible for everything. But how does this consciousness arise? What do we need for consciousness? Well, we need those inner, outer, and both inner and outer phenomena. Inner, why inner? Why inner in the first place? Now, inner usually means something that is conjoined with consciousness. In Tibetan, the word is the term is really conjoined with consciousness, being part of a person's mental continuum, being part of a person's continuum. Okay, so in general, inner means that anything that is part of me, I can describe it as inner. Okay, being conjoined with consciousness. So my mind is conjoined with consciousness anyway. It is consciousness, and it's conjoined with other consciousnesses, but also my body. Anything that's part of my body is conjoined with consciousness in the sense that, well, when I was conceived, at that time, my consciousness connected to my body. And so there's this close relationship between mind and body. Okay, so in Tantra, in particular, in the Tantric texts, you find elaborate explanation of the energy in the body related to the mind, and so forth. And so in that way, it becomes obvious. My body is conjoined with consciousness. If my body were not conjoined with consciousness, it would be called a corpse, and it would start to decay. Therefore, any type of mind, any type of physical aspect, physical aggregate, anything that's part of my body is described as inner. All right. So what is the opposite of inner? It's not outer. Actually, it's not inner. That would be not being conjoined with consciousness, because you can have something that is both outer and inner, as we come to see in point number 3 here, or the emptiness of that, which is both inner and outer. So therefore, that is outer and inner both. It's not inner and not inner at the same time, but it's outer and inner both. All right, so therefore it's conjoined with consciousness. Outer refers to being perceived by the sense consciousnesses. You can perceive it with the sense consciousnesses. Therefore, my sense faculties, the sense faculties, they also, the Thubten Jinpa, for instance, describes them as the sense organs, but I've also seen in other translations when they describe them as the subtle sense organs. And I prefer that, because ordinarily we say the sense organ is the eyeball. That is, the eyes is the visual sense organ. That's the coarse sense organ. But there's also a very subtle aspect of, it's much subtler. It's not just this coarse sense object like the eyeball, but there's a subtler level that's probably, well, on a molecular and so forth level, where you can no longer perceive it with your sense consciousnesses, and it's part of the body, so it's inner. Okay, so it's inner. And that refers to, therefore, the 6 sense faculties plus the mental consciousness. That's also seen as sense faculty. I explained this last time. And again, it's part of the body, it's conjoined with the body, and it cannot be perceived with the sense consciousnesses, the 5 sense consciousnesses, so the mental consciousness. Therefore, that's inner. Having understood this, now we need to understand the lax inherent existence. It's so crucial for us understanding, making sense of the world around us, but only on a conventional level. It's merely labeled. And then you have outer, the next type of emptiness. So in verse 181 and 82, we learned about the lack of inherent existence of inner emptiness. Sorry, the lack of inherent existence of inner phenomena. And then in verse 183, and the first 2 lines of verse 184, so 183 and the first 2 lines of 184, we learn about the emptiness of outer phenomena. What are outer phenomena? They're only outer, they're not inner and outer, only outer, which means they're not conjoined with consciousness. They're not part of a person's continuum. And even the mental objects in this case would have to be objects that are not conjoined with consciousness, strictly speaking. Whether it's really seen in that way is to be debated. But strictly speaking, here in this case, outer phenomena are not conjoined with consciousness. So they're not part of a person's, a being's continuum. So what would be like form? Okay, so form, actually external forms, strictly speaking, would be, well, the objects around us, the shape and color of a tree, for instance, or the shape and color of a car, sound of traffic, and so forth. What is the mental object? Well, what is the mental object? A mental object here, it could be seen as a mental object, not just an object you think about, that you perceive with your sense consciousnesses, but also a mental object, a mental object form, as it may be also described, which is a particular type that can only be perceived. So it's actually something physical. Maybe it doesn't have to be something physical, but if it were something physical and it's that mental object, it's something that you can only perceive with your mental consciousness. What would be an example of that? Well, subtle particles, the subtle particle around us. We cannot perceive them with our sense consciousnesses. So you may think, oh, well, yeah, we could take a microscope and we can see. But when you blow up something in the microscope, well, you don't see the actual thing. You see a representation of that is huge now. Well, huge in the sense big enough so your sense consciousness can perceive it. So when you look at a body cell, what you're seeing is not the body cell. The body cell is tiny. You can't perceive that with your eye consciousness. So such a body cell, for instance, that is an example of, or let's say like an external object, because we're talking about outer objects, an object that is only a mental object. That is number 6 of the outer objects. It's an external, I don't know, an object that you mentally take apart with your mental consciousness. You take apart, let's say, a car into its atomic particles, for instance. And so if you have an understanding of the working of atoms and so forth, you can mentally, of course, think of the atom of this car. So that atom is a mental object. It's an outer object. It's not conjoined with the mind, with consciousness. It's not part of a person as such. And therefore, we can say it's a mental object, not any of the sense objects, and it's an outer phenomenon. This is quite complicated, outer, inner, but this is why in this book, Science and Philosophy, according to the classical Indian text, this book is really nice on that one. It gives really good explanation on exactly this, really science according to the Buddhist view, like what is outer, what's inner. And if you pay attention to it, it's actually really interesting. It's a nice way of dividing things up. Anyway, we can only scratch the surface on that, but just wanted to go over it again. Anyway, so these are the outer phenomena, just outer, not inner, because they're not part of a person. Plus, they can be perceived with any of the 6 consciousnesses. Yes, they can be perceived with any of the 6 consciousnesses. Wait, no, they're not outer. They're not inner. They're not inner. So now I'm getting confused. They're not inner because they're not part of a person's consciousness. They're only outer. They're only outer, therefore, which means, what does that mean? Well, that's mainly why they're outer, exactly. They're not conjoined with consciousness. That's it. But then you have those which are both inner and outer. That's verse 184, lines C and D. I think on this I didn't do yet. So the lack of intrinsic existence of both, that is inner and outer. Okay, so the lack of intrinsic existence of that which is both an inner and an outer phenomenon. So that is the emptiness that is described here. And something that is both inner and outer, what is it? Well, it's outer because it's an object of the 5 sense consciousnesses. So in that sense, outer here it refers not to the subtle sense faculties, but it refers to the coarser sense faculties, which we ordinarily identify as sense faculties, the physical basis. So what do you need? The subtle sense faculty of the eye. What do you need for that? The eyeball, for instance. So just the fleshy entities, if you like, which we can perceive with our sense consciousnesses. They're here described as outer because they can be perceived with any of the sense consciousnesses. All right. Yes. So therefore, they're outer in this context here. Outer because they can be perceived with sense consciousnesses. So in the second category, I mentioned the subtle particles. They're outer, but for a different reason. Outer in the sense of not conjoined with consciousness. So it takes on a different meaning. It's a little confusing, and it's great for a debate, actually, because it's so confusing. But the point is, the point is nonetheless, so without going into debate on this, but the point is here, so the emptiness of those aspects of the body, such as the sense, coarser sense organs, and anything else, and really, well, like when you say the eye sense organ, all right, the coarse eye sense organ, that's probably, well, the optical nerve and the whatever you could perceive with your sense consciousnesses, that's the coarse type. And that is not all pervasive. That's part of the brain and part of the face. But then when you have the body sense consciousness, I mean, what is the coarse sense organ of the body sense faculty? Well, that's the whole body, really. Right? I mean, it's not just the skin, it's not just the outside. When we hear tactile object, we have a sense, oh, something you can perceive with your skin, and the skin plays a huge part. But of course, there's more than that. We perceive stuff in our whole body, right? When you have a belly ache and so forth. So when you read this book that I just talked about, I can never say its title, it's so long, Science and Philosophy, it's got some really interesting explanation on what is a tactile object. It talks about old age. It's a tactile object. And I was first like, wow, old age, right? Sickness, old age. Of course, I mean, old age. It talks about the heaviness of the body. That's something you don't feel with your skin necessarily. It's your whole body feels that. For instance, flexibility of the body. I mean, these are all aspects we don't feel with any of our other sense faculties, our other sense consciousness, but with the body sense consciousness. So it's not just the skin. Anyway, so here the emptiness of that which is both inner and outer phenomenon. This phenomenon refers to any part of the body that is part of it, but that can be perceived with the sense consciousnesses. All right. Okay. So far, hopefully that's clear. That's all we need to make sense of the world around us. We need the world around us. We need the subtle sense organs, and we need the coarse sense organs. And of course, those are just examples of inner, outer, and that which is both inner and outer phenomena. These are just examples. But based on that, we need to understand, however solid it seems, and the better we understand it, the more we get a sense. It's very concrete in our mind. It becomes so clear. Oh, this is this is that. But it lacks inherent existence. Those are the first three types of emptiness. And then emptiness of emptiness. That is the fourth type of emptiness. That's verse 185 and 186. Okay, so 184 were the last two lines. What were those last two lines? The lack of intrinsic existence of both. Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. And then you have 185 and 186. That all things lack intrinsic existence. This, the wise one, the Buddha, or the wise ones, all the wise beings who realize emptiness, describe as emptiness. But emptiness itself is in turn held to be devoid of essential emptiness. So it lacks inherent emptiness. It doesn't exist inherently, in other words. Emptiness itself lacks inherent existence. Now, we may initially, when we hear about emptiness, assume that, well, the one thing that is actually truly existent, that is emptiness itself. But of course, that's not the case. So emptiness itself lacks inherent existence. It's merely labeled on the basis of something other than itself. All right. Well, it's labeled on the basis of that which it is empty of. So it's the lack of inherent existence of self, for instance, the lack of inherent existence of a car. You don't have a general emptiness. We talk like we express ourselves. We make it sound if there was this emptiness, this overarching emptiness, but there isn't. It's the same as I can say this about a table. When I say table, as if there was this universality called table. But really, when we look for it, I mean, it's not there. I mean, in the end, it's the table I possess, the table you possess, the table in front of you, the table in front of someone else, the table in your living room, and so forth. So these are all different types. When it comes down to it, it's a certain type of table. When I say person, in the end, there's no universality, some overarching person somewhere in the universe. And then there are all these examples, which, well, we are these examples. No, there's just, we say person, we just use the term in that way. But in actuality, it refers to certain persons. And that is true for emptiness as well. Emptiness. It refers to, of course, the emptiness of the eyes, the ear, the nose, and so forth. So therefore, every time you talk of a specific emptiness, the emptiness of the self, well, it's labeled on the basis of the fact when you analyze this self, you can't find something that exists other than a merely labeled self. So based on that, we label emptiness. If you didn't have a conventional self, if you didn't have a car, you didn't have the emptiness of car, and you didn't have the emptiness of the self. So this is why emptiness itself is, of course, merely labeled. It doesn't exist inherently. But we have a tendency, and I briefly said it before. First of all, in general, when we don't know something, we don't really hold on to it to be inherently existent. We don't give it much thought. But the more we think about it, the better we understand it, the greater the sense, of course, that it's there, concretely there, and so forth. But what's more so, when we study the Dharma, it's not just about understanding things, but also changing our attitude as to what is important and what is not. Maybe previously making a bunch of money, making a lot of money, maybe becoming famous, I don't know, having a, surgery to improve our outer appearance. Well, these things are no longer important, or spending hours and hours in the gym. Instead, we become more focused on meditation, on spiritual development, on possibly examples like His Holiness or the Buddha himself. And before long, that which previously seemed so intrinsically money and, I don't know, a toned body and all that, or even our afflictive emotions, we previously never thought of them as being something negative. So before long, they're negative, they're undesirable, and our holding on to them as inherently existence lessens a little bit. Instead, the Buddha seems to be inherently existence. Nirvana exists truly. Emptiness, whoa, emptiness. So our mind automatically changes its emphasis on what is inherently there. That's why a lot of people, like if they were previously groupies of some kind of singers, famous singers, well, if you become spiritually active, you can see possibly the same people, maybe other people as well, whereas previously they were running after, I don't know, who's a famous singer, Adele or Robin Williams. Well, I don't know, these are some time ago. Anyway, so previously they were groupies of them, now they're groupies of the lamas, right? So again, the sense of, oh, the Lama, I need to be in the presence of the Lama and so forth. So the amount of attachment that arises, it shows, because attachment, this kind of attachment can only arise if we have a strong sense it's inherently existent. And so emptiness itself is really hard. I mean, with emptiness, because it's a permanent phenomenon, it's hard to be a groupie of emptiness. So it doesn't work that way. I mean, the objects we're attached to are usually impermanent phenomena. You want to maybe be praised by the Lama, be special to the Lama. So it's different. Emptiness works differently. It's not really that we generate attachment as such, but more that we perceive it as something inherently there. This exists truly. So emptiness exists truly. And of course, therefore, this view needs to also be overcome. We need to understand the emptiness of emptiness itself. All right. So that's why this is explained. This emptiness of what is called emptiness is known as the emptiness of emptiness. So the lack of inherent existence. So here, the basis of this second type of emptiness is not the car, is not the self, but is the emptiness of the self, for instance. So the emptiness of the self, that itself lacks inherent existence. So therefore, it's the emptiness of the self. It was taught to counter the grasping thought that emptiness is something real. Now, ordinarily, what's debated in that context is, for instance, well, that kind of mind that grasps at the inherent existence of emptiness, is it an innate mind or is it intellectually acquired? There's some debate on that, because if it's an innate mind, so we're born with that, but we don't understand emptiness. So how innate can it be, right? Like we don't really know what emptiness is. So is there an innate mind we were born with? If it's intellectually acquired, well, that intellectually acquired would mean, I mean, if I just take emptiness, if I don't understand what emptiness is and I hold it to be inherently existent, that is not a mind grasping at the inherent existence of emptiness, because what I'm perceiving is not actual emptiness. It's not actual emptiness. It's just some idea of, I use that word for something, for something that actually isn't emptiness at all. For instance, if I don't know what a car is, and I have some weird idea what a car is, in actuality, I'm actually focusing on a bicycle. If then I perceive that bicycle to be inherently existent, and I keep calling it a car, I don't have in actuality a mind that perceives the inherent existence of a car. Because when it's explained to me properly, I'll understand, well, this is actually not a car at all, it's just a bicycle. Likewise, if I don't have an innate view of holding on to inherent existence of emptiness, well, I could have an intellectually acquired one. But how would that happen? Because once I understand what emptiness is, then intellectually I will not come up with believing that emptiness exists inherently. I'll understand that the car doesn't exist inherently and a chair doesn't. So why would I suddenly believe emptiness? But well, maybe I've understood it with everything else, just not with emptiness, and that could arise. So the different views on that. And some would say, well, even with this innate mind, once you have like a sense of what emptiness is innately, even though you're not born with that, because emptiness was not the object that you perceived when you were born, but once you've understood it, you have this natural instinctive sense, oh, it exists inherently. Anyway, it's a matter of debate. Just introducing some of the views on that. But definitely here, Lama Tsongkhapa says, well, there is what's called emptiness of emptiness. It lacks inherent existence, and we need to understand that. All right, that's that. Now the next, we'll continue with the next set of 4. What is the next set of 4? The second set? Well, here it's verse 187. It starts with verse 187. Geshe Jinpa mentions space. Actually, space is not the word that is used here. It talks about the 10 directions. But the 10 directions, what does that mean? It's actually just this, it really refers to the space. So even without the word being explicitly mentioned, it makes sense, this all-pervasive space. Now that should not be confused, because the word space in Tibetan well, in Tibetan and English, as we translate it, there are two types of space. There is permanent space and impermanent space. Uncompounded space is permanent. What is referred to here is impermanent space. It's space around us. There's empty space. There's lots of empty space around us. If there wasn't, I mean, even if your room is full with stuff, in order for you to be able to move around it, you need to have some empty space. So that is the space referred to here, impermanent space. Space that appears to your eye consciousness when you perceive, for instance, an object on the other side of the room. You need the space in between. So although in Tibetan they say it's like whitish, I guess it's because of the dust particles, but it doesn't appear whitish to us, only in the long distance. Then we have a sense it's whitish. But anyway, without describing its color. So the space. So this space, the space that's everywhere. Okay. Now, that's not talked about that much. The uncompounded space is seen as much more important. And it's a little difficult initially to understand it, but it's said to be very helpful in order to understand emptiness. So I thought in this context, I may just talk about it, although it's not mentioned here. Here's just the ordinary space. So this ordinary space, this impermanent space all around us, it is an impermanent phenomenon that is free of what is called obstructive contact. It's no obstruction. I can move my hand, right? There's no obstructive contact. So it is this impermanent phenomenon that's changing and that's everywhere. It's immense. And based on the fact that I can move my hand, right? Based on the fact that it appears to my eye consciousness and so forth, I label space, empty space. And so it lacks inherent existence. Of course, it's only labeled. But still it exists. So it's the emptiness. It's immeasurable. I'll explain uncompounded or the permanent version of space in a moment. So anyway, so it pervades all the worlds, all the different realms of existence. You can be sure there's space. In fact, the one thing that is present mostly is space. I mean, what quantum or what physicists tell us, that the largest part of an atom is space, empty space. It's mainly made of empty space. In fact, our body is mainly made of empty space. Everything seems so solid around us, and it is. However, it's mainly made of space. So this immensity, it becomes, especially from a scientific point of view, it becomes even more obvious. So space pervades everything, all the worlds, and all the beings these worlds contain, but it's still just a conventional phenomenon. And what it exemplifies is the immeasurability, even the immeasurable thought. So it's comparing it here to the four immeasurables. So it's this immenseness, this immeasurableness, if you like, immeasurability, in the sense like, why do we say the four immeasurables? You wish for all sentient beings, for immeasurable sentient beings to be free, to be happy. Okay, so the four immeasurables, the first one being immeasurable love. Immeasurable in the sense that you're focusing on immeasurable sentient beings. So in that sense, all sentient beings, just as sentient beings are immeasurable, okay, because of the thoughts, these four immeasurables are immeasurables because they're focused on something so vast. Likewise, here we say that space is so vast, so immeasurable. That's the example why it's called this great immensity, if you like. So space is a great immensity in all directions, just as there's sentient beings everywhere in all directions. All right. Okay. So having explained that, then, that space itself is devoid of all 10 directions. So it's not inherently devoid of all 10 directions. It's not inherently possesses inherently these 10 directions, or refers inherently to these 10 directions. So therefore it lacks inherent existence, and this is the emptiness of emptiness. This is the emptiness of the great immensity, of the great one. it was taught to counteract clinging to great immensity as real. So there's a sense of, wow, it's so immense, it must really be there. Again, it's like I said, when we hear everything is mainly made of space, there may be a sense, oh, that's really there. Everything else is not as concrete as it seems, but the space is really there. Again, that needs to be counteracted. But then, what I mentioned earlier on, whereas what is mentioned in verse 187 and 188 is the emptiness of impermanent space. There is what's called permanent space or uncompounded space. And that is actually, when space is mentioned, it seems that is mentioned more often, although in this case it isn't mentioned, but more often uncompounded space is mentioned. So what does that refer to? What did I say earlier on? Impermanent space is this impermanent entity that lacks obstructive contact. That is impermanent space. Permanent space is the aspect of the absence of obstructive contact. Just that absence of obstructive contact. Taking it from that perspective, not the object that has that characteristic of lacking obstructiveness, right? I can move my hand so there's no obstruction, but just this absence of obstructiveness, just that mere absence, that is permanent. It's not a dynamic phenomenon that changes moment by moment. It's not something dynamic. It's similar to me saying lack of BB on your table. Okay, BB is no longer the prime minister. Okay, never mind, but I'm still can say BB much better than the name of your new prime minister. I don't even know his name. Anyway, so the lack of BB, the lack of Donald Trump on your table. There's just an absence. So your table is impermanent. Donald Trump is impermanent, but just the absence of Donald Trump, that absence is not a dynamic phenomenon with one moment giving rise to the next. It's just an absence. It's an abstract, just absence. So that absence is permanent. Now, if you take this absence of obstructiveness, just from that perspective, just seeing that abstract absence, that is described as permanent space. That's it. So that permanent space, that absence, has to be present within the impermanent space, because otherwise you couldn't have it. So the space around me that I can move my hand through is impermanent, it's ever-changing. Just that aspect, that abstract aspect of the absence of obstructive contact or of abstraction, that is permanent. And it's helpful to understand that something impermanent can exist, impermanent space can exist, because it lacks that obstructiveness. Similar, I can exist because I lack inherent existence. Okay, so just as absence of obstructive contact is just a mere negation of something, so is absence of inherent existence is a mere negation of something. Both negations exist, both are permanent. And they make it possible for impermanent phenomena to exist. So in the case of space, that mere absence of obstructiveness makes it possible for space, impermanent space, to exist. And in the case of emptiness, it makes it possible for all phenomena to exist, myself and other phenomena. And just that absence, just that non-affirmative negation, as it's called, or non-implicative, it doesn't imply anything, but just the absence of inherent existence, or in the case of uncompounded space, just the absence of obstruction. That is described as a mere negation, in that it doesn't imply anything. It's a non-implicative, I think it's called non-affirmative, non-implicative negation, in that it's just the absence of something. And that is so important in the process of understanding emptiness, understanding that emptiness means, when you realize emptiness, what appears to your mind is just a negation. It's just an absence. And a lot of people have this wrong view that an absence cannot be realized. It cannot be understood. We have a sense there must be something affirmative. No, Our mind has the capacity to understand just the absence, has that capacity, but it's hard. We're not used to it. We're not used to, our mind is more adding things, affirmative. It's affirmative. It adds things. It takes in more things. It always gives phenomena and an existence, some solidity, which they actually don't have. So our mind needs to slowly be trained in just mere negation of inherent existence, which has never existed and will never exist. But so we can train our mind to just focus on that absence. And to understand this better, we have the example of space. All right, so that I wanted to say in that context, although it's not what is mentioned in the verses. Therefore, just to say one more time, we have impermanent space, the space around us, and then we describe just on the basis of this absence, just that the aspect of the absence that is described as, or that is labeled uncompounded space. Whichever space it is, lacks, of course, inherent existence. And here, impermanent space, since it's everywhere, it's called the emptiness of great immensity. Then, next is Nirvana. Verse 189 deals with the emptiness of the ultimate. Here, ultimate is, and Lama Tsongkhapa explains it that way, ultimate in the sense of the ultimate cessation. It depends, it refers to, the actual cessation. This is a matter of interpretation. Is this an ultimate truth or not? As emptiness is an ultimate truth, but even without getting into this, ultimate in the sense like the final cessation, like the cessation of suffering and its causes. So that is described as the supreme goal. It's also just an absence, by the way. It's just an absence. It's just Nirvana is not a place. It's not something impermanent. It's just the elimination, the absence. But here the difference is that whereas obstructive contact has never been present in space. It's not called space if there's something obstructing it. So space is wherever there's no obstruction. Therefore, for space to exist, it has always, impermanent space has always existed with the absence of obstructive contact. It couldn't exist otherwise. Or in the case of myself, I've always existed as lacking inherent existence. Here, Nirvana is an absence where that which is now absent was previously not absent. Afflictive emotions. They were previously in the continuum of someone who is now an arhat. Well, previously when they were not an arhat, when they were not a liberated person, or when they were not a Buddha, these things that are now absent, they were there. The afflictive emotions, for instance. So now the afflictive emotions, the absence of the afflictive emotions in the continuum of someone in whose continuum they were previously there, that is called Nirvana. So it's usually not described as an absence as such. It's usually described the elimination, because the word elimination implies previously they were there, now they're gone. But it's also, in the end, it's just this non-affirming negation, nothing in its place. There's just the absence. And that is Nirvana. And Nirvana means if your mind is the mind of a Buddha, then only because you have this absence in your mind. You have the absence of afflictive emotions, or you have the absence of cognitive obscurations in your mind. So that absence is no longer there. And so it has to be stressed again. Nirvana is permanent. It's just an absence of something that was previously there. So that is the supreme goal. It is the ultimate. Okay. It's the ultimate in that the transcendence of sorrow that is devoid of an inherent nirvana. Doesn't inherently exist. So devoid of itself means devoid of itself existing inherently. That is the emptiness of the ultimate. And as I said before, as our focus shifts, as our that which we consider important. Well, previously, whatever was important to us previously, now it's no longer important. Now nirvana becomes important. And so we may hold that to be inherently existent, but it doesn't. So then, to counter the grasping thought that nirvana is something real, the knower of the ultimate truth, the Buddha, the knower of the ultimate truth, taught this emptiness of the ultimate. So the Buddha himself, here too, the Buddha himself, he taught that also nirvana lacks inherent existence. All right, that should be enough for today. 190, we got to 190. I hope the verses are clear, but they're pretty straightforward. So it's really just trying to understand what the emptiness is of. So we've finished the first 4 and started with the emptiness of the immensity, or the great immensity, which refers to all pervasive space. And then we've discussed nirvana. And for next time, it's conditioned and unconditioned phenomena, which again requires a little bit explanation. Great. So it's time to do a meditation. I hope I wasn't too fast. I get carried away, and I always think I speak so slowly. And then when I listen to a recording, I realize, oh my God, was that me? So please remind me if I was too fast again. Let me know. I'll try and slow down a little bit. But you see, we can go through these verses quite quickly and still explain them, hopefully clearly enough. Okay, so then let's start some meditation as usual, to let go of any confusion, any disruptive thoughts. Let's keep the mind focused, single-pointedly focused just on the breath, on the breathing. So as Chandrakirti has taught us, well, as we first set out to learn the Dharma, we recognize the importance of the mind. Its central function. And in that which gives rise, that which causes our perception. Our perception of sense objects as well as mental objects. Yet it's important to remember that just as our mind lacks inherent existence, the subtle sense faculties they're empty of inherent existence too. And the objects of our mind, they're also merely labeled but not just the inner and outer objects. Also the coarse sense faculties. That are both outer and inner. They're just labeled. Cannot be found. And engaging in ultimate analysis. And even their emptiness. The emptiness of inner phenomena. The emptiness of outer phenomena. The emptiness of myself. And of other phenomena. It lacks inherent existence. One of the main topics of the Buddha's teaching is merely labeled. For the fact that there's no self that can be found among body and mind. That exists above and beyond being merely labeled. This fact we label emptiness of the eye. And when conducting the ultimate analysis, taking the emptiness of the eye as your object, you won't be able to find that emptiness. For it is just labeled. And how about what science tells us is everywhere? In fact, the physical world exists mainly of that which is space. Even something as tiny as a single atom consists mainly of space. That is also just labeled. Even though it's everywhere, I can't find it. And engaging in ultimate analysis, searching for it. It is also merely labeled on the basis of something other than itself. It certainly depends on a basis, such as the empty space in an atom, in a cup, or in a room. Therefore, empty space is also labeled on the basis of this atom, the cup, or the room. And on the basis of the absence of obstructiveness. And it is based on that understanding of the different types of emptiness that we hope to remove our root ignorance, and thereby all the other afflictions, in order to attain nirvana. The ultimate goal, the ultimate cessation. Yet that doesn't exist inherently either. Cannot be found. For it is merely labeled on the basis of certain types of mind, such as ignorance, having existed previously, and now having been irrevocably eliminated from the mind. That absence is labeled Nirvana. So there's absolutely nothing to hold on to as having any intrinsic and objective existence. Not even the highest goal we pursue. And so now to conclude your analysis, whatever insight you've gained, whatever feeling has arisen, single-pointedly focus on that for a few moments. Then let's dedicate whatever positive potential we've accumulated here together to dedicate it first of all towards our own liberation, our own enlightenment, not just for our own welfare, but for the welfare of all sentient beings. May this become a cause for us to, for the sake of others, quickly attain the enlightened state of a Buddha. But in the meantime, may it become a cause for our great masters like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and our other wonderful lamas to have an extremely long life, a healthy and long, long life, so that they may continue to teach us through their words and their example. And in that way, lead us to enlightenment. But may our virtue also affect those around us in a positive way. May it help Geshe Punsok and Tali Lubin to recover very, very soon from their illnesses. May it help all those who have great mental pain, grief, anxiety. May it help them to overcome these negative states of mind and find true peace of mind and happiness. And of course, the way Shantideva puts it, may all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. And most importantly, for as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. All right, thank you very much. And just to remind you what to do, don't forget about bodhicitta. Of course, I forgot to mention it at the beginning of this session, but of course, again and again, generate the mind of enlightenment. Don't give up on that. Set an alarm or whatever reminder to continuously generate that mind. But then the main focus should also be focusing on this immense suffering of this world. Physical suffering, as there's so many examples of it, but also mental sufferings, how it's created by this fear of losing something for the self, losing the I, losing reputation, losing possessions, and so forth, and how sentient beings suffer so endlessly because of that. On our own example, becoming aware of that, and then focusing on all sentient beings and sincerely wishing them to be free from that suffering, from the suffering of suffering, but also from their limited suffering of change, which keeps them attached. And of course, their suffering, their all pervasive compositional suffering, which keeps them in that state of misapprehension, of ignorance of reality. All right, and then all that remains, have a great week. Be well, be healthy, and I'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Dankeschön.
Night.
Gute
Gute
Nacht.
Nacht.
Thank you, Dhamma friends.
Thank you so much, Geshe-ma. Thank you.